Right, we've just passed 11 o'clock, so we'll make a start. So good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. Just to let you know, first of all, this webinar is being recorded so that we can share it with people who aren't able to make it just at the moment. It will be available on the Sustainable Places website to watch again. So we're very happy to welcome Alan and Andrew to our webinar today. There will be time for questions and discussions at the end. If you have any questions as Alan and Andrew are presenting, please either add your question to the chat box or use the raise hand function, and we'll come to your question at the end of the presentation. So with that, I'll hand over to Alan and Andrew.
Hello, Borodar. Well, we've been introduced by Ruth. Just to say, Andrew and I are old hands at this. As I'll explain, we've been on quite a long journey thinking about sustainable development governance in Wales, and we really thank Place for hosting us this morning and the opportunity to share some of the research we've done. We definitely see this as a space to debate and discuss governance for future generations. We'll run through the slides. Probably be about 35, 40 minutes. Andrew's going to take a few towards the end of the presentation. And as Ruth says, we'll try and answer some of the questions that pop up, and we'll get through as many as we can. Just to flag up now, as Ruth said, this will be on the website. Slides will also be along with an accompanying research paper on ResearchGate, which you'll be able to download after this webinar. So it's great that it's being recorded, because I know there's some colleagues in New Zealand and Tasmania who can't stay up late enough. I know we have a couple that might be tuning in, so thank you. Really appreciate you getting involved. Okay. So what's our research about? Well, we're really interested in how the future generations and long-term, two bits of this legislation that we have in Wales, are really distinctive bits of the legislation, how they're being approached by public policymakers. So we've been following the efforts of public service boards through wellbeing planning, and I'll talk about what they are and what they're required to do on the next slide. But we've been following them to see whether, as a result of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, there's this shift in public policy to look at generations yet to come. You know, that's what's unique about this act. Are future generations' needs being represented in policy discourse? And we've been really interested in revisiting some of the key academic and policy literature and commentary from elsewhere in the world to think about good approaches to governance for future generations. So what we hope our work will do is offer some ways for policymakers in Wales and elsewhere to look at relationships between generations and what they mean for policy, how approaches to growth and degrowth impact on those, and the spatial dimension of well-being. And ultimately, we'd like the voice of future generations to be enhanced. So we see this work, it's forming part of a book chapter for colleagues in Tasmania, Jan Linehan and Peter Lawrence. And we've also got this research paper on ResearchGate, where we'll start collating and collecting pieces of work that we've done, and that's designed to be quite an interactive platform for us to develop discourse in Wales on this. So just a quick word on methodology. We've used framing as one of the key methodologies. For those of you who are familiar with that, it's picked up in the research paper. We've done a documentary review, not only of the PSB wellbeing plans and the associated documents between 2018 when they were produced and now, but we've looked at web-based material for all the Public Service Board partnerships in Wales between then and now. So looking at progress reports, minutes, governance reports, performance management frameworks. So we get a real understanding, not just of the plans, but what's emerging from them. We've looked at support materials produced by the Office for Future Generations Commissioner, Welsh Government, and others during this period, post-enactment, to understand what support public bodies are getting around this issue. And we've looked also at some of the independent reports from Wales Audit Office, WWF, the Commissioner herself, and other commentators, as well as National Assembly discourse. So we've really tried to take stock 5 years in, as wellbeing planning is a central tenet of the Act. How well is it reflecting future generations and the long term? So this diagram is just pointing out a few things. I talked about Andrew's, my kind of long journey over 20 years monitoring this, both as academics and practitioners and consultants. This shows the evolution, I guess, in Wales from Agenda 21 in the early 90s through to now. And Jane Davidson's book, Future Gen, really does well in kind of capturing that journey. But on a national level, through Agenda 21 post-Rio conference in 92, the Government of Wales Act came in 2000. That required Welsh Government itself to have sustainable development schemes. They've evolved through various iterations into a Sustainable Development Bill and the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. The relationship of this Act to that journey is one around sustainable development. And what makes this Act unique from our point of view is two aspects. It focuses on future generations and long-term planning. So at the same time, on the right-hand side of the screen, we've had local partnerships made up of local government and other partners on a similar journey. They've been required by Welsh Government to develop community plans, set up local partnerships, and long-term planning. So we've had this evolving relationship of governance after the Government of Wales Act, and Welsh Government have required public bodies to do stuff, and how they use public funding to support communities. And we've had austerity in that journey. So in terms of devolution, Welsh Government have a certain number of powers, but not as many powers as they'd probably like. But the key kind of pressure point, if you like, is how they influence public sector bodies to deliver their services and to spend their money. So it's no surprise that the Future Generations Act is focused particularly on the role of the public sector and how they work with the communities. So this has kind of culminated in a major opportunity to include the interests of future generations in the way that we deliver services, but also plan our communities. Are we taking the opportunity? So I'm going to remind you about public service responsibilities. This will be bread and butter to many people who are online, but maybe new to others. So I'll try and keep it brief. This is all covered in the paper. But essentially, public service boards are local partnerships made up of different bodies, many of which are funded by Welsh Government, but there are others that are funded by the police through central government, and a range of other organisations, including community and third sector organisations that are required by the Act to plan collectively to deliver local wellbeing. They must, according to the legislation, deliver what they do in accordance with the Sustainable Development Principle. Many of you will be aware of the different elements of that. but one of them is around planning for the long term. So the statutory requirement is to plan for the long term. And the two jobs that they have initially to do is really get an understanding of the local area through a wellbeing assessment, and as a result of this, prioritise some objectives that they can work together on in a local wellbeing plan. So as a result of this, we might reasonably expect planning and delivery of activities through these plans to focus on not just current generations, but future generations and the long term. So there are 19 public service boards in Wales covering 22 local government areas. That's their task. So one of the things we wanted to do through the methodology is, rather than just kind of review all 19 PSBs and look at common shared policy agendas, etc., and see where there were kind of commonalities and differences, we really wanted to dig down through the minutes, the progress reports, the performance frameworks, to understand what are the interventions, you know, what are the things coming out of the plan, the activity to improve local well-being, to kind of get beyond the strategic vision, if you like. And what we've done is we've looked at these in detail for all 19 plans and tried to put them into kind of 4 areas, which I'll explain in a minute. And we've kind of reflected on those around, you know, where's the added value for future generations in the activity. So the first one is, you'll be unsurprised, there's a lot of shared policy agendas. So in those plans, there are shared commitments from partners to work together on, well, I've listed them there, all sorts of different policy agendas that we've been quite used to working on in the public sector in Wales for 20 years or more. What we believe is that the commitments are focused on improving the future well-being of generations already born. So with very limited focus on generations beyond this. So that's the first one. The second one is a raft of activity around building an understanding of place. So this is, you know, we need to understand more about our communities' well-being and how we improve that. So there's all sorts of activity around mapping and research projects and risk assessments. There's been some interesting work done in Gwent in South East Wales, which covers 5 PSBs on future trends. We cover that in the report. But what we would suggest is a lot of this gathering of evidence is on the current conditions in the area. Where future trends have been used, it's looking at the welfare of current generations rather than considering the livability of places for future generations. The third area is integrating service delivery. So this is where organisations are coming together and saying, look, we can work better together, we can work more efficiently, get much more added value for our communities by joining together. And there's a list there of activities that are listed in the plans. But what we found, not just in the plans, but in the discourse after, there's a really limited reflection on how these services might need to change in the locality in future decades. It seems to be more of the same, but together. And then the final area of activity is around place-based service delivery. And this is brilliant projects enhancing well-being now for current generations, really innovative stuff around social prescribing, health pilots, sustainable food, loneliness, really worthwhile, fantastic, relevant and necessary stuff. But our take on this is there anything really new or novel in this activity? Is this stuff that was already planned or underway? And we certainly think that the benefits and outcomes are firmly focused on the well-being and the future well-being of current generations. So it's hard to kind of avoid the conclusion, and commentators, we refer to these in the paper like Anderson and Wallace, they've described much of the activity of PSBs as rebranding existing activity. So for us, where's the value for future generations? Is this signaling a shift? Well, no, we don't believe it is, and here's why. And I've tried to keep the kind of criticisms to one slide because we're more today about, well, how can we improve our activity? How can we do this better? But we've been quite critical in the report about what's been produced in the first 5 years in terms of long-term and future generations. And I think necessarily so, we need to improve this. I think first point, long-term outcomes in these plans and everything produced from the plans are really vague, they're aspirational, they're poorly defined. We're getting limited commentary on explicit outcomes for future generation. Yeah, there may be a benefit, but a lack of specificness. We see long-term policy challenges tackled by very small initiatives or projects and relatively little focus on how we need to transform strategy or delivery systems to tackle them. And as a result of that, we're not getting any evidence of transition pathways, route maps, targets, milestones to tackle stuff from short to medium to long term. So we've got this limited reflection on the efficacy of current delivery systems. And this is something that Andrew, myself, and Mark Lang picked up in our work for the Commissioner around wellbeing assessments. Are we doing enough at scale soon enough to tackle this long-term stuff? The seventh area is around, we have a lack of focus on place-based challenges in many of the plans around the stuff that future generations rely on, like having a resilient landscape or ecosystem services or infrastructure that works into the future. And we have a great focus on future generations as current young people and children, and a big focus on early life interventions. Yes, they are our future generations, but what about generations after that? We're not going into the well-being of generations beyond. So we have most of the plans, despite the fact that the guidance is talking about a generation as being 25 years, most plans have got a 5-year focus, and only 7 of the 19 actually went beyond 10 years. So do we think, we're shifting here? No, we don't. There are some exceptions. I'll talk about 3 very briefly. Cardiff's Public Service Board, that's the capital city of Wales for those internationally kind of dialing in, they provided quite a strong narrative for change over time and the pressures and challenges to future place-based livability. Powys PSB, so that's a large inland rural county, they have a 2040 strategic vision. It's looking at key aspects of the future, especially its economic vulnerability and utilising its natural assets. And Pembrokeshire PSB, this is a coastal area reliant on tourism and agriculture for its economy. That's focused on strategic outcomes for various interventions up to 2030. So there are some signs that the penny's dropped, but we can be very, very clear that the evidence for any kind of shift in public policy towards the long-term and future generations is weak. And that what makes this act so unique isn't being reflected in one of its central tenets, which is well-being planning. So we're interested in opening up the debate and the conversation about how to improve this. Why is it so difficult for PSBs to represent generations to come? Now, I'll put two quotes here, and they're really designed to get us thinking about how we represent future generations. And I'm not naming names, but these are quotes from, on the left-hand side, quite banal kind of communication around future generations. And these are taken from the plans and annual reports. The board has always got an eye on the future. We aim to use 2040 as a focal point. These statements are made, I think they're both from executive summaries, and yet the plans don't illustrate that at all. They don't do what it says on the tin. And what we find in the detail is policy offices including stuff in these plans which is far more focused on the needs of future generations. Again, these are taken from plans. We'll focus on building the long-standing natural, cultural and social assets to secure these for future generations. Very clear. Another talks about the local development plan, safeguarding land for future generations. So this is more than semantics. This is about it's about leadership and communication and how these plans focus on future generations. So we're getting limited signals that future generations are being represented in their own right in assessments, prioritization, plans or interventions. So one of the things we wanted to look at over this period was activity around supporting change. And what we've done is we've looked in detail at the advice and practice since enactment, and we've looked at the futures work. I talked about the Gwent work before, but Public Health Wales and others have done some really interesting work looking at future trends, and Welsh Government also support public bodies by producing a future trends report. We've looked at the material produced by the Office of Future Generations Commissioner, available on the web, plus the annual reports of the Commissioner, trying to understand Art of the Possible initiative, live labs, and looking at the frameworks they've produced for public service planning and for scrutiny, to understand how both long-term and future generations have featured in this work and how public bodies are being encouraged to think about the future. And then we've looked at the Commissioner's advice around wellbeing planning, letters to public service boards, the various annual reports, including the 800-pager that we've just had, and also the discussion between the Commissioner and National Assembly for Wales on progress. We've looked at various reports from the Wales Audit Office, both on public service boards and public bodies, and also looked at discourse around Welsh Government and their approach to the Act, including work carried out by WWF, and also discourse around the Third Sector Alliance and others. So we've really kind of delved deep to ask this question: are we focusing on future generations and the long term here? Our conclusion is that what we're getting from the various tools and the way the tools are being utilised by public bodies is we've got, quite rightly, this predominant focus on well-being goals and ways of working for the Sustainable Development Principle, of which long-term is one. But there is a huge emphasis on whether public bodies are going through the process of using those, and public bodies are very demonstrably saying, look, we've gone through this process. But we didn't get a sense from the content of all the raft of tables and diagrams which explain this, that future generations and the long term are really being considered. Big focus also on the legal obligations. We've been asked to do this, therefore we're doing it. Look, we've done it. We were really interested in the content. And what we found was that there's really limited focus on sustainable development, which is what this act is all about. You know, how do we develop over decades into the future? Certainly a lack of focus on the nature of growth, and Andrew will come on to growth and degrowth in a little while, and really quite weak explanation of potential long-term outcomes from wellbeing planning. Certainly a lack of focus beyond the current generation. So something is awry here. We have a lot of activity, a lot of public bodies. The public policy community in Wales is being recalibrated, but we don't understand why there is this kind of schism or gap between what's being produced and what they're being asked to do. So why are the interests of generations to come being marginalized in this discussion? So we went back to the literature, academic literature, you know, the analysis of academics and policy experts across the world, and we tried to kind of pick out some important learning from their work to strengthen the Welsh approach. We believe there are kind of 6 areas where we need to focus our efforts over the next period. One is to distinguish between long-term intergenerational investment between generations, and secondly, distinguish between that and policy and interventions which focus on the future welfare of current generations. We're doing the latter. We need to be doing more of the former. We need to definitely get into acknowledging intergenerational bargains, policy choice and trade-offs. We have quite a non-politicized kind of cozy approach, I think, to wellbeing planning. There's some difficult choices in there about how we grow, how we develop our communities in Wales. We definitely need to represent the needs of the unborn as a prerequisite for effective long-term planning. We're not doing that enough. Yes, we need to establish new approaches to this, governance, policy and behaviour. This is more than putting a template on the end of a report. You know, this is about representing unborn decisions, about discussions about how we do things, where we do things. So it's more than a technical fix. This is a kind of cultural and institutional approach that needs to change. And we've had lots of great information about potential institutional reforms from elsewhere across the world, about how to better reflect this. We need to understand what impact they may have. So, for example, you may suggest we put in a future scrutiny committee into local government, but we are really interested in, well, what's the impact? Do they actually affect any decisions? Can you give us some examples of decisions or investments where the needs of future generations have really been reflected? And we absolutely understand the difficulty in dealing with uncertainties about the future. But we believe that the policy community are kind of adept enough to make some really good guesses about the future and the way things might develop in their patch. They're the experts on their patch. So, you know, how much information do you actually need before you can start thinking about the future? So we've come up with a way to distinguish between different generations, and this is the paper title is there in the bottom right-hand corner. We think this is not semantics. This is a really important way of distinguishing between generations and their relationships, and the paper builds on that. So we think there are 4 types of needs we need to focus on. The first is on intergenerational needs between the current generation and future generation. So an example of this might be a really deliberate and mutually beneficial approach to maintaining our soil resource so that we can carry out our current agricultural practices, but the future agriculture that will rely on this, they're in as good a place as we are now. So that's intergenerational needs. The second area is transgenerational needs. So this is beyond current generations. And this is activity that we might benefit from now, so that future generations can maintain their own well-being and their descendants' well-being. So an example is us reducing emissions now enables future generations to have a stable climate. If we adapt, then they have communities that are tenable. Okay. Third area, and this is an area where we think public service board planning is now. We're looking at multi-generational needs. So stuff that supports multiple generations as a byproduct of doing stuff which addresses the needs of current generations. So investing in green infrastructure or open space now, it benefits current generations, but actually further down the line as that open space matures, we get more biodiversity, carbon sequestered, and so we have this kind of knock-on ripple effect. But the important distinction here is it's not deliberative, it's a byproduct of what we're doing now. And then finally, intergenerational needs, which focus on outcomes within a current generation. And we think that public service board planning is in this place as well, where we get an activity which focuses on the present, to, in this case, developing a daycare centre next to a school, which encourages support within current generations. That centre may or may not be there in future generations. It may only have a 30-year life. So we think that there is a distinction to help us explore these relationships. And we think most public service board stuff going on now is in the bottom half of this diagram. We think there needs to be a far more deliberative approach to focus on future generations. This is something that we picked up from the literature. People like Jonathan Boston down in Wellington in New Zealand writes really well about this deliberative approach, deliberately focusing on future generations in their own right, rather than as a byproduct of what we're already doing. So I'm going to pass on to Andrew now. He's going to talk about our thinking around growth and degrowth and spatial issues as well. So Andrew, I'm going to go on to the next slide. Are you on unmute? Ready to go?
I've unmuted myself specially.
Excellent. Over to you.
Thank you. And actually what I'm going to be doing just in the next 2 slides is just sort of thinking about some of the wider implications of the work that we've been doing and how its sort of relevance has really exploded with the implications of the current pandemic, which actually give us the opportunity to think in new ways about our models of growth. One of the things that we've really wanted to pick up on, which applies far beyond Wales, much broader reference, and as I've already mentioned, so this is being cast in a new light because of the debates and the challenges that are arising through COVID-19, is how we think about growth, how we think about the needs of future generations in relation to growth, and about the trade-offs between different generations. And there's been a couple of very interesting sort of commentaries on how we think about the nature of growth in future generations. And a couple of people have been particularly influential in the way in which Alan and I have been thinking about this has been Brooks and Koch and Goff. And what they argue is that to better reflect the aspirations of future generations, current generations have a moral obligation to pursue a degrowth agenda. And that's because if we're thinking about transitions to a lower carbon and a lower resource intensive world, then we have to really think about our obligations, our moral obligations to future generations. Now, of course, in doing that, thinking in that way about growth, it very much clashes with the current generation's expectations of ever-improving health and well-being. Part of the way in which we're hardwired into our political culture is a sense of things continually getting better, of improvements in our welfare, of improvements in our income, improvements in the quality of our life. Part of the ways in which political debate is constructed. And what people such as Brooks and Koch and Goff are saying is actually those are political decisions that we're making, and we're not really thinking as much as we perhaps should be doing about alternative models. And so therefore, what we need to be able to do is to think about what sort of growth model do we want, and what are the tensions in thinking about resource allocation between generations. And that's what we've tried to depict here in this figure. Our current neoliberal growth model has a sense of resource allocation and reallocation that takes place, but it's through a trickle-down effect. The rich carry on getting richer, but part of that, the wealth that they're able to accrue trickles down to others in society. And what it means in terms of future generations is that we move from a trickle-down to a trickle-on. The wealth that we're able to accrue today will trickle further forward into the future, so that future generations will benefit. Of course, what this current growth or development model enshrines is inequality, and that inequality will continue into the future. At the other end of the spectrum, we have a degrowth economy. This is what being much more sympathetic to people such as Goff. What they're looking for there is a much more equitable distribution of resources within generations, but also between generations. And what they're seeing, therefore, is that we challenge the ways in which we think about our economies, our understanding of growth and development, and we think about what do we need to be able to pursue our lives, what are our aspirations, how might those be met, and the resources that we have available to do that. In between this, we put the model of a steady state economy, which has been particularly attractive to some environmental economists. And what we've done for our purposes here is to characterize steady state economy as essentially one which is conserving existing social and economic relations. So the economy isn't in a sense growing, but neither are resources being redistributed to any great extent. Right. Now, one of the things that a number of commentators have made, it is a really important point, is that if we do not explicitly address these issues of development and growth, then by continuing on our current trajectories with our current aspirations, then we are foreclosing opportunities to future generations. So next slide, please, Alan. And so the decisions about who gets resources and when matters for our current generations and also for our future generations, and for the communities that we live in now and the communities that future generations will live in. So there are important spatial implications in our decision making, decisions that we make today. And as Alan was pointing out earlier, there's been a lot of work taking place within the PSBs about better understanding their communities as and as the people who live in them today. much less work though has taken place in trying to better understand what might be the lived experiences of our future generations and of the communities that they might be living in. But by thinking about our future generations and also about our future communities, we can begin to better understand the implications of our current and alternative growth models. And that's because when we think about people, we often also inevitably think about places. We think about how people live their lives, we think about how they work, we think about their aspirations, we think about their relations with others and their relations to the environment. And so we inextricably link together people and place. And as Rhys Jones and his colleagues from Aberystwyth have pointed out, we do need to better understand the characteristics of local communities and their resource needs. And so we need to better understand what are those relationships and interrelationships between our spaces where future generations are going to live their lives. What are going to be the ecological resources that they will have access to? What are going to be the constraints that they will face? So that we can today begin to think about how we can better meet their needs. And in doing that, we begin to think about how climate change or the effects of an aging farming community or landscape management, flood risk, whatever it might be, the decisions we make today about what happens to our landscapes, to our environment, to how we seek to manage our communities are helping to shape decisions for the future. And we need to better understand how those decisions that we make today are linked to our growth models. Now, as Alan's very clearly explained, one of the things that we've realized is that the governance of well-being in future generations is perhaps proving more challenging and more problematic than had been recognized. And one of the ways in which we've been able to observe this within Wales is around the challenges that have taken place around integrating evidence from spatial planning, from local development plans, into wellbeing planning. Much planning activity is actually future focused. Planners are trained to think about the future. Their plans are over extended time horizons. And many of the decisions that are made around our land use, our spatial development, have implications for current generations, but also for future generations. We lock people into particular ways of working and living into the future, about the ways in which they can engage with their environments and their resources into the future. And one of the things that's been notable for us from our observations in Wales is about how difficult it has proven to be in practice to link together better the information, the knowledge and the expertise from planning as a profession, but also the content of local development plans into our wellbeing planning. And on that note, on the challenges of governance, I'll return you to Alan to round off this presentation.
Thank you, Andrew. So, strengthening the voice of future generations. We do have some suggestions. We make a lot of suggestions in the paper. So this is kind of necessarily brief onto one slide. But we think the three kind of big takes from this research and stuff we'd love to help with over the next 5 years is really we need to establish more effective methods of representation of future generations. And this might be an area where we can develop dialogue and representation of their need through citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries, and I know there's been a lot of development in places like Leeds and elsewhere, where there are independent commissions, committees, assemblies, juries that are asking questions on behalf of future generations. So this isn't about having a young person attending PSB meetings. This is about truly drilling down on behalf of future generations' needs and representing them. Second thing, which Andrew's alluded to, is understanding how approaches to development in communities might play out within and between generations. And we've offered one way of exploring that. You know, are we really looking at a relationship with generations beyond the current generation? Or are we just looking at the here and now? So this is about being deliberative and looking at their distinctive needs specifically, not as a byproduct of current activity. And then the third area is around defining specific long-term outcomes for future citizens based on discussion of these trade-offs, what we could reasonably expect going into the future. And that might be about place planning, it might be about service planning, but the sort of stuff we're thinking about is around decadal route maps for place, for delivery, and for change from the growth approach that we have at present. So we believe policymakers need to become more adept at how future citizens benefit from a decision, what risks might occur from that decision, and really the opportunities that decision might offer for long-term well-being. And if we start doing that, we'll be starting to use the opportunity that this legislation offers us. We'll start to use it well. So in conclusion, our paper provides more background on these suggestions. This has been necessarily brief, but is designed to kind of be a taster of the work that we've done. We'd love to develop the conversation with you. Andrew's managed to load the paper, and this slide set will also be on ResearchGate. We'll put some other stuff on there that we've worked on together to develop the conversation. So in conclusion, I'd just like to thank you all for listening, and we've got two questions which might shape that conversation, but we're happy to take questions. First one is, why is this so difficult for the policy community in Wales and elsewhere? And how can we improve collectively? Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you very much, both. That was really fascinating. So we'll move on to the questions that we have in the chat box. So Sarah McBride-Stewart asks, can you tell us about the decision to use the language of the unborn? The phrase has an extremely sensitive history.
Okay, I hadn't picked up on the sensitivity, so it would be really nice to have some advice on that. It's our language. It's not from the literature. We were using it to distinguish between generations who were born in the hospital down the road to those ones that aren't yet born. If you can give us some advice about a more sensitive language, we'd take that on board.
Thank you. Terry has made a comment just pointing your attention to Lorena Acciente's thesis, which was passed yesterday on the Future Generations Act in the Cardiff City region, focusing on the young. Sounds like that might be relevant to your work. And Jane Davidson is also saying, if attendees are interested in the story so far, there's more information on her website and in her book. So I
think also, Ruth, she's actually doing her own webinar this evening. So if I forward you the information on that, perhaps you can share that with people participating.
Yeah, we can certainly do that. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Neil Harris asks, it's only the transgenerational needs quadrant that will really shift the work of PSBs beyond where they are now. The other three capture what they do now, catering primarily for present generations. So how do you get present generations to support something that's of no direct advantage to them?
Andrew, do you want to take this one? Is that a typically awkward question from Neil?
It is. It's a really good question, isn't it? And it's one of those that gets back to, I think, to the role of leadership and the ways in which leaders engage with their citizens. It's, do we have people who are able to persuade us that that we need to pay more attention to future generations, that we need to pay more attention to the ways in which we're living our lives. And often when we look towards our political leaders, that becomes particularly challenging for them to engage in that sort of communication, that sort of language, and to be able to persuade us. The whole way in which political debates are set up is about, we promise you better futures, we promise you improved welfare, we promise you improved quality of life. So I think and that's very much for us, for our here and now, rather than thinking about children, grandchildren, or future generations. It's always the hope that things will get better until we have something like the current pandemic. And again, we look to our political leaders to see if they can reshape our development strategies, to think in new ways about how our economies may work, about the ways in which our societies may function. And actually what we see is probably enormous variability around the world with ways in which our political leaders are able to engage with their citizens and promote those alternative models of development. And of course, when the other way of looking, that's very much a top-down perspective. The other way of looking at this is from the bottom up. What sort of changes are communities seeking to promote for themselves, and how do they go about doing that? And here there's often a lot more sort of positive stories in a way. And things like the transition towns movement would be a really good example of how communities want to try and take some sort of ownership of their futures, and of how they can plan their futures, and how they can think about their current and future citizens living in those particular communities.
Can I pick up on a couple of points there? It answers some of Neil's questions, but I want to focus on Michael Campbell's point there about the opportunity that the Act presents. I'm pint half full today, Neil. You know, what I'd like to see over the next 5 years is policy community, the policy professionals coming together and being more deliberative to get us into that fourth quadrant. And I think, yeah, guidance can help. It always helps, doesn't it? But it is actually within policy officers' gift to use this legislation to have different sorts of conversations, the sorts of deliberative conversations we've been talking about. But, you know, having been in a role similar to Michael, you know, a while ago, it is so difficult to shift the nature of conversations from normative approaches to start thinking differently and utilize the framework that the Act provides with us. And Michael says there, we haven't got the time, the space or capacity to do anything new. What's been really interesting over the past few months is I've been doing some work in North Wales, where Michael is based, with the Regional Leadership Board around the response to the climate emergency. I've had really interesting conversations with the leaders up there about, well, what's good leadership for the climate emergency? And, you know, for me, this is about leaders giving people like Michael the license to use this legislation how it should be used. And I utterly understand, Michael, your point about the comfort blanket, but you know, we have the license here. You need to be enabled to have those conversations in PSBs. And you know, what we see from the evidence is normative approaches. So the challenge for the next 5 years is, you know, using some of the frameworks we've talked about, but many others, to deliberately look at future generations.
Thank you both. Sarah McBride-Stewart has also said, as an addition to Neil's comment, to what extent has the austerity and precarity suffered by the current generation and their need to have agile responsiveness to the current economic environment shape this focus on the present?
Andrew, can you take that while I read this and think about it, please?
Thanks, Alan. This is how teamwork actually works, isn't it? Yeah. It is. It's a really good point. We have a lot of focus on our futures. It's particularly when we're insecure, and these things don't play out evenly across society. People who are insecure, people who are in poverty or close to poverty, clearly have a much closer sense of how they can meet their immediate needs, and quite rightly so. And so it may well be that we are seeing increasing attention being given to our immediate futures, and we can see that in all sorts of ways around us, and it does make it, in a sense, much more challenging to think about the future and the longer term, when we do have an often overwhelming preoccupation with the immediate future.
I think it's a really important question about not just austerity, but how leaders view whatever is in their inbox currently. So I'll refer to the North Wales work on climate emergency again. Absolutely, bouncing back from COVID is so important. But I think the skill of leaders should be to see an opportunity in thinking about, in that case, addressing both the climate emergency and the post-COVID growth emergency as mutually inclusive. And some municipalities like Bristol are doing so. So some of the bounce back packages, millions of pounds to support SMEs, etc., have low carbon strings attached. They're using it as a way of influencing the future on a number of fronts. So it's that sort of kind of lateral thinking that I think is perhaps sometimes missing in some of our senior officers and civil servants. Not seeing things as exclusive, but seeing them as inclusive. Future generations and sustainable development shouldn't be an add-on. It should be absolutely integral to all of the thinking that's going on around our communities.
Thank you both. Terry asks, do PSBs need real scenario planning as part of their, do PSBs do real scenario planning as part of their activities? And how do we link in the New Wales Strategic Planning Framework and the NRW area statements?
Wow, 3 cracking questions. Andrew, while you think about that, do you want me to talk? I'd return the favour. Scenario planning is an interesting one. About 10 years ago, I was doing stuff for WLGA around that in Swansea and Newport, looking right down at the ward level and developing scenarios around climate change and food security and energy security. And it proved quite popular, certainly in Swansea, with the politicians and the ward members themselves, because it enabled them to understand some of the constraints and issues that Andrew was talking about before and how it might impact on their patch. So, I've always seen it as a very useful communication tool. I think the leap is to use it as a strategic planning tool. And I do wonder, again, years ago, having worked in a planning department, how well planners, when they're working on LDPs, how well, economic development officers use scenarios to think about different growth paths. So I think your question about, strategic economic strategies is a really interesting one. Are we looking at alternative growth paths or is there a kind of one size fits all? So I think we need to all become more adept at visioning different types of futures, thinking about how they compare, what the trade-offs are for future generations. And I'll say it again, it goes beyond strategic environmental assessments and sustainability appraisals, which can often kind of seem like a tick box exercise. For this to work, there needs to be proper interagency, intersector strategic debate about what the future looks like. So I'm kind of referring back to Michael's comfort blanket. I'm going to nick that off you, Michael, because we all have our specialisms. It's time we started using these specialisms together a little bit more, and as the Act says, start to work across silos, but work across silos to think about place, growth, and the way it develops. Andrew, have you got a different take, or do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think we should just try and carry on. So I was just looking at the clock as it ticks away in the corner, and we've already just passed 12. I can see there's some other really interesting questions there that perhaps we ought to try and move on to if we have the opportunity to do that.
Do you fancy any of them? You want to take one?
No, that's all right, Alan, you carry on.
Ruth, do you want to pick out another one for us?
Yeah, just to answer Nikki's question about the link to the paper. Nikki, we will send out the link to everyone after the webinar so that you've got an opportunity to go and visit. Sarah McBride-Stewart is just saying that it's the referring to the unborn. It's the language used in pro-life and pro-choice debates for women. It might carry significant other weighty meanings and discomfort and not be a term that women can use publicly.
Thank you for the steer. We'll address that. Thank you.
Okay, so the next question is from Kaya Smythe. The understanding of environmental value present at the Wellbeing Act is a little ambiguous, at times tending towards an instrumentalist understanding. Might that add to the difficulty of setting clear plans for the future?
Andrew, this is your bag.
Alan, you've really learned the art of delegation, haven't you? Yeah, it's a good point. It's more instrumentalist now versions of understanding the environment and what it means for the benefit of humans. It clearly is part of how the environment is thought about in Wales, but also elsewhere. And that does tend, I would agree, to think to encourage people to think in more short-termist ways, because we're clearly thinking about what our relationship to the environment and what value do we give to the environment, rather than what values might the environment have for itself in a sort of more ecocentric perspective. And I guess therefore that sort of more anthropocentric engagement the relationship that we have with the environment does encourage us to think about how we can manage the environment, how we can exploit the environment, how we can use the Earth's resources in ways which are catering more for our current needs, rather than thinking about longer term relationships with the environment that would come through a more ecocentric perspective.
Can I pick up on that? It's just to flag up another piece of work that Andrew and I have been involved in, and I know that others such as Terry's been involved in. It's around the relationship between the environment and foundational economy, and Place kindly hosted a seminar in February where we got a range of people together to explore the relationship between the environment and developing discourse around the foundational economy, where traditionally there'd been this very anthropocentric approach of using the environment. And what we were trying to do was to kind of shift the discourse and say, actually, economies rely on ecosystem services, and if we don't manage them well, then the foundational economy will be, I guess, contribute to well-being less. So there is a paper that was pulled together. WWF Cymru commissioned the work. I'll seek their permission to pop that onto ResearchGate as well, because it really digs down into this idea of the relationship between economy, development, and environment. You know, I found that a very, very useful afternoon, actually. So there we are.
Thank you both. Next question is from Richard Cowell. Does it come down to willingness of politicians not just to engage, but to institute measures that bind them and the future? One example is the 2008 Climate Change Act, but it looks like the Welsh Future Generations Act largely fails to institute any measures that prevent public service bodies rolling forward with business as usual, i.e. no bite.
I'll take that one, Andrew. As Richard knows, this is an area of keen interest for me. I think in terms of approaches to climate change, you know, we have a really ambitious 2030 carbon neutral public sector target. Does that constitute bite? I think it's certainly concentrating minds in Welsh Government, PSB partners and local authorities. So, you know, that's an example of where Welsh Government have taken the lead and saying, you know, this is what we want to try and achieve by 2030. So in effect, that's taken the commitment in the 08 Act and focused it on the public sector, which is where they have most influence. I think the other aspect of the Act around climate adaptation, the governance around it is far weaker. You know, PSBs in terms of approaching climate adaptation, there is some work that's gone on again in Gwent in Southeast Wales around the lived experience and climate adaptation. There's work going on in West Wales in Fishguard and Newcastle Emlyn, deep dives in effect around climate adaptation. But sectorally, there's no pressure being put on the public sector to develop climate adaptation plans. And there's this big schism between that lack of bite and, you know, in the example of Fairbourne up in Gwynedd, you know, there is a community that is no longer tenable. And our systems, our governance, our finance isn't set up to actually deal with the consequences of that. So, you know, bite, for me, bite around climate change would, within the next 5 years, we'd have an approach to managed retreat that really protects, you know, residents like the ones in Fairbourne. And, you know, we have government and agencies working together to deal with the consequences of it. So I've rambled a little bit there, but I've tried to bring in a kind of a specific ask, if you like, of public service boards. Yes, climate adaptation is a key issue for you to look at in the future, but my word, it's going to impact on your communities. How are you preparing for that? So yeah, climate change always gets me going. Andrew.
Andrew, did you have anything to add?
Difficult to follow that, really, isn't it? Yeah, Richard's point's really interesting, sort of governance one, because it does set up about, you know, how is it we think that change is going to be achieved and the ways in which legislation might be able to achieve that change. So it sort of gets into the sense of the responsibilities or the commitments that are there in the legislation or in the guidance that follows it, and to the extent to which it's binding or more advisory. It gets around to the ways in which we think about how language, discourse or commitments are changing, and are they moving in the direction that we would like to see them moving. It gets to the sense about the ways in which people and organisations may be held accountable for their actions or inactions, and about how we might do that. We don't tend to do it at the electorally, but we do have organisations such as WAO, for example, which have done some very effective scrutiny of activities relating to well-being or to climate change, for example. But it's then difficult to see what follows on from those reports. So I guess to answer Richard's point, we sort of build in to the ways systems that our governance systems are sort of sufficient ambiguity and space, so that it's actually difficult to hold people to account for the changes that we would often like to see taking place, and the changes which they may also be committed to, but which they may then find more challenging to achieve in practice.
I think to pick up on one point there around accountability on inaction, I think in order for this act to be more effective, we need more accountability around what it's not doing rather than what it's doing. And you know, I'd like to see National Assembly for Wales kind of strengthening their scrutiny around how effective this is, and challenging Welsh Government a little bit more, because it's the inaction that worries me. You know, having been we've been in it for the long haul, haven't we, Andrew? For almost a generation, it's 20 years. You know, are we making better policy and better decisions 20 years on with this act in place, or were we doing better 20 years ago? And I think we need to reflect on that. Is this act giving us the shift and the impetus we actually need to deliver on these long-term challenges for future generations?
Thank you both. Maybe we can wrap things up with a comment from Neil. He says, it's a comment and a thought, not a question. I'm wondering if there's anything to learn for considering those who are not present with us in time from how we relate to those who are not present with us in place. For example, we can become interested in outcomes for those far away from us spatially, and maybe extend some of that into those distant from us in time. A bit high level and abstract, but might open up some way of thinking about distant futures from relating to distant places.
I think that I definitely need a copy of that, Neil, because that's a very thought-provoking. Do you know, I think we can think about people in different time. It's been really interesting seeing some of the discourse around visioning in wellbeing planning, and I wish it would be far more focused on place. You know, to actually envision what life might be like. I'm going to pick Abertillery randomly. You know, Abertillery, what life might be like in 2050, given current trends. You know, is it going to be stark? Is it going to be comfortable? If current approaches to growth carry on, what are the implications of that for Abertillery? You know, what can young people, old people expect? I think policy officers and PSBs can do this. So I think it's about putting ourselves in their shoes. We have loads of local knowledge, loads of local data, massive intelligence in the organizations that we work for. We just need to imagine these people living in another time in these places. I don't think this is rocket science. We just need to be given the license to do that, but not just do that as a kind of academic exercise, to think about the implications of that to our current approaches, to be reflective. So thank you, Neil. That's kind of got my grey matter whirring there. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much, Alan and Andrew, for joining us today for a very interesting discussion. And thank you to everyone who's joined us for the webinar today. We do have another webinar next week if you'd like to join us. So And this will be available on our website next week for those who couldn't attend, and we'll send round details of Jane Davidson's webinar and the link to the research paper. So thank you very much, everyone, and hopefully see you again soon.